I started playing Astronarch in February, and I didn't originally have any strong impressions of the game, but the game kept drawing me back in, and I've now grown to love this game a lot more than I thought I would originally. I'm going to talk about what this game is, what I like about it, and where I think it could improve. So let's get into it. So what is Astronarch? It's a roguelike autobattler in its purest form that I've seen. You select heroes to go on a quest and fight monsters along the way. The fights themselves are completely automated, hence autobattler. You can choose where to place your heroes, which determines the attack patterns and order of both heroes and enemies. You can also choose your paths. You decide when you want to fight normal enemies, extra mini bosses, or other random events. The only active element within each fight is the ability to use one of your potions when you see fit. So as one example, you can pop a potion that makes your heroes invulnerable right before a big attack hits them. But also, the fights themselves never really drag on. So while you don't participate in the fights actively, you're still frequently participating in the game because each fight is so short. And between each fights, you get to customize your heroes. Each hero has a passive and active ability you can upgrade by getting ability orbs from boss fights. You can also equip up to 3 items on each hero, and this is where a lot of the build variety comes in. There are over 20 heroes in the game, each have a unique feel and playstyle. And there are around 150 items in the game as well, so you can see the number of synergies and combinations that are possible. Certain items synergize much better with certain heroes, and playing around with that and experimenting there is a lot of fun, and I really enjoyed that in the game. For example, some heroes benefit from more just pure attack speed or defense, while others synergize with more unique effects, such as items that give shields in certain conditions, working well with heroes like the Wild Mage that has their passive ability benefit from having a shield on them. You also create a party of several heroes, starting with 3 and finishing with 5, so you have to plan and find synergies there as well. Using the same example as before, the Crusader works well with the Wild Mage because the Crusader's active ability gives shields, which helps the Wild Mage's passive ability that again benefits from shield on the Wild Mage. There's just a surprising amount of depth there with these builds, which really makes the game just super fun from a strategy standpoint. And there are other important mechanics as well, such as specific placement of the heroes and adjacency, which I'm just not going to dive more deeply into in this review. However, I do think there could be better hero balance. Maybe it's just the way that I played the game, but I found that maybe a quarter of the heroes be much better than the rest, or at least more important to have at least one of. In most of my successful runs, I've had at least 2 of a core set of 6 or so heroes. This is because there are only a couple really good pure tank heroes, such as the Crusader, and having healing feels especially important in longer battles for health sustain, but only a couple heroes have good heals, such as the Cleric or the Druid. So a couple of these 5 character slots feel kind of fixed from the get-go. However, for the other slots such as pure DPS or secondary tank options, I found that you can basically use any of the characters if you have the right items, so I did feel like all characters are viable in those extra slots. And that brings me to another nice mechanic in Astronarch. Each run is split up into 3 acts. You start off with 3 heroes, you can add a 4th going into the second act, and a 5th going into the final act. This adds a mechanic where you can select your later heroes based on what you find item-wise earlier on. For example, I found myself often picking up my full DPS character in the second act, so I can look at what items I found in the first act and see what characters that synergizes with. If I get more attack speed items, I'll get an attack speed DPS character. If I get ability items, I'll get an ability-based DPS character. Within each act, there are also 3 different paths that have their own enemies, mini-bosses, and final boss for the area. As you get to higher difficulty levels, it's really important to learn what enemy types you'll typically encounter in each path or lane, so you can pick heroes or items that give you an edge in fighting those enemies. The game also uses a morale system, which means successful fights earn you morale, but you also lose morale for each hero that falls or gets knocked out in combat. So you don't have to win every single fight in the game to continue, which is nice, but if you lose too many and lose all your morale, or if you lose to a final boss fight of an area, you will still lose your run. Additionally, I have a couple minor complaints with the game. 1, the wording of certain items are confusing or a little ambiguous. I've had to kind of test them out or just guess how they actually work. Along similar clarity lines, I think that the stacks of conditions could be a little more clear. So if you could see the number of frost stacks, for example, without having to hover over it, that would be a great update. Additionally, some game stats are a little confusing at first. More specifically, I didn't understand how the numbers for speed or MP worked at first until I played for a couple hours because the numbers weren't intuitive to me and weren't really explained in game. But all these complaints are more minor. And one last thing that I'll say in this section is that the game has really good pacing within each run. There aren't any areas that feel super tedious or have frustrating difficulty spikes, with maybe the possible exception of the final boss occasionally having a frustrating spike. But as a whole, the pacing of the game is really well done. Now let's talk about RNG and randomness in Astronarch. Does it provide freshness or frustration? I don't think randomness is ever a huge negative in Astronarch or a huge positive. While the layout in each act is randomized, you can always choose which of the paths you want to follow. Certain things are set in stone, but you're given enough flexibility and warning that it's almost never frustrating. The one minor exception I have is with mini-boss placements. In each act, there will be a mini boss for each of the 3 paths, and defeating them gives you an ability orb that allows you to upgrade a hero's active or passive ability. These are very big upgrades, very important, so you usually want to face all the mini bosses if you can handle them. However, there are certain map layouts that make it so you can't fight all 3 mini bosses on each run, therefore giving you worse rewards than if you had a better map layout. And that's something that annoyed me a little bit, not having the potential to get the best rewards because of the map layout as opposed to my choices. The other main area where RNG comes in is in what items you find and how well those items fit with your heroes. There are certain common items that you'll find on almost every run, but specific more rare items you only find every couple of runs, if that. But there's also ample counter RNG measures here. You always get a choice of what item you want, usually a choice of 3, as a reward for beating enemies. Additionally, you can sell extra items to merchants and buy the items you want from them. And you can upgrade your items as well, which gives you more control over your build, what items you want to really double down on and focus on. And as I mentioned earlier, because you pick up 2 or more heroes after your run starts, you can choose to pick up heroes later that fit the items that you have. So this item RNG is never really that frustrating, and it's mostly a good element to the game, keeps each run fresh, make you have to deal with what you've got, a classic roguelite scenario. RNG matters in some other smaller areas too, such as what enemies you find in a given fight. The enemy pool for each path is set, and each path in each area has a different enemy pool, but you might get different enemies for each specific fight in that path, which is good because it adds more variety to the game. You're not always fighting the same 3 enemies every time you go to the bottom path, for example. Along similar lines, the random events have a decent amount of variety for your first playthroughs, but you'll get familiar with all the events before too long. The game's strength and variety lies in its heroes and its builds. Those synergies have a lot of depth, but there's not that much variety in its enemies or its events. But as a whole, I would say that Astronarch does fine with RNG. It's never super frustrating, but it feels like every run is different, even if a couple of areas could use a little more variety. Now let's talk about progression replayability in Astronarch. It's a game that has some horizontal progression, as well as corruption levels or difficulty levels to climb. The corruption levels are fairly straightforward and standard. Basically, each new level adds new twists that makes the run harder, such as fewer potion slots or giving normal enemies more attack power. This is a nice difficulty system to climb with 20 total levels. I beat the base difficulty on my first try, so these difficulty levels are definitely needed in the game. I'm currently on Corruption 13, and I'm aiming to beat level 20 if I can. And some of the other unlocks in the game come along with this corruption system. For example, mini heroes start off locked, you can't play them, and you unlock them by completing specific challenges in runs or getting to a high enough corruption level. Additionally, you can level up each hero by beating higher corruption levels with them. This doesn't change them mechanically, they play exactly the same and aren't any stronger, but it adds a cosmetic aura around them that scales with their level. Along with these cosmetic changes, getting cumulative hero levels unlocks more items for the game and flushes out the item pool. So there's some nice horizontal progression there as well. But I will say that most items are unlocked from the start. These items you unlock later on are a small subsection of the item pool. As a whole, progression in this game is focused on relatively quick horizontal progression through unlocks of heroes and items, followed by more long-term vertical progression through difficulty or corruption levels, and leveling up each hero for fun if you want to. I've had a lot of fun playing through the game so far, but I do feel that there might not be enough progression here to really keep me as long as some of my favorite roguelites have. Right now, I'm climbing up difficulty levels, but I'll probably stop playing when I beat level 20 or reach my difficulty ceiling that I can't pass. Finally, let's talk about the story in Astronarch. The game does actually have a minimal story that explains why you're doing what you're doing, which is saving the world from destruction and corruption. However, the story is only really integrated as occasional and skippable text dialogues that never really got me invested in what was happening. Additionally, the game also just kind of ends when you beat it. It's a little anticlimactic both mechanically and story-wise. Still, I do appreciate that there is some story there, even if it's not as fleshed out as some other games. Also, the game has a very simple, albeit unique art style. Astronarch was developed by a solo dev, and it's really impressive for that, but I do wish the characters had proper attack and ability animations instead of just moving forward to attack or jumping up to use an ability with little bright orbs flying around. The game did recently get a new soundtrack, which is really good, especially because the original soundtrack was a little bland. So what's my verdict on Astronarch? As a whole, I had a lot of fun with this game, and I think that it deserves more attention than it's gotten. The core gameplay has a surprising amount of depth to it, with character and item synergies, but it's also more passive than action roguelites because, it's not a battler. I think that the biggest drawback of the game is that the progression is a little lacking, and certain game elements like the events could use a little more variety. The recent update added more item unlocks, which is great, but the progression is still primarily focused on climbing difficulty levels, which might not be for everyone, and has a limit of, when you reach the max, you're kind of done with that. Still, if you're looking for a more strategy-focused roguelite, I'd strongly recommend checking out Astronarch because I've had a lot of fun playing through it. Please like this video to help me out, and I'll link the game in the description for those that are interested. Thanks for watching.